Namaste, everyone. Welcome to the Cārvāka podcast. This is your host, Kushalmehra. All right. So today's topic is Americans never understood Afghanistan like the Taliban did. And to express that point of view, we have Shadi Hamid with us. Shadi, thanks once again for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me. My pleasure.
All right, guys. So, why is this title given to the today's discussion? Is that Shadi recently wrote a beautiful op-ed in the Atlantic, and I think it was on the 23rd of August, and I read it, and I was like, I have to get Shadi back again to talk about this, because obviously, from an Indian perspective, obviously Afghanistan is a very strategically important place, but I wanted to understand a unique perspective, and I love reading Shadi is because he brings a refreshingly new perspective every time when I read him. And the good thing about Shadi is he doesn't expect you to agree with him, but he's willing to talk about it. So Shadi, let's begin with this. So you've been commenting on this because I've been following your views on this for a while now, because I went back and started reading on things you've said in the past too. You've always said this, and you've been very consistent. And in fact, this can be picked up right from your book, Islamic Exceptionalism too, because it kind of stems from that worldview. So why do you say that the Americans never got Taliban?
Yeah, well, first of all, it's not just about the U.S. not getting the Taliban. It's about the U.S. having a fundamental difficulty understanding Muslim majority countries, whether it's the Middle East or in South and Southeast Asia. And obviously Afghanistan is a case in point that, and there's, I think there's a lot of reasons why that's the case. I mean, some of it has to do with the argument in my book that Islam is difficult for outsiders to understand in a nuanced way. And when it comes to American policymakers, they don't really understand religion that well, because most of them are secular. We're talking about a liberal elite that doesn't really get religion, or they see religion as something to manage or to control or to lessen. They don't want to see too much religion in public life, and they want to promote more secular ideas. And even if they do have more familiarity with Christianity isn't always the best lens with which to understand Islam, because Islam is different than Christianity, right? When it comes to Afghanistan and the Taliban more specifically, my argument in the Atlantic essay was that we had this idea that we could reshape or re-engineer a culture, and we took Western concepts that might work well for the US and we tried to superimpose them onto Afghanistan. Couple examples that I emphasize in the piece. One might be obvious to listeners, which is we spent close to $1 billion supporting gender equality programs in Afghanistan, which is good in theory. Like who would disagree with that? But when it comes to make that the priority and to focus on that, in my view, it got the order a little bit wrong, because what Afghanistan needed first and foremost was a functioning, pluralistic, democratic system, and we didn't really focus on that. In fact, instead of focusing on helping Afghans build a legitimate political process that different factions could participate in, we supported a top-heavy, strong, centralized presidential system. And when you have a divided society along ethnic, religious, and linguistic lines, you don't want to concentrate too much power in the presidency, because then it makes politics zero-sum. It makes it winner takes all. And whoever wins the presidency then dominates the rest of the political system. So our prioritization was wrong in a number of these ways. And then, of course, the second thing I'll mention is we were also trying to build a Western style formal legal system. So again, we spent close to $1 billion trying to develop the trappings of a formal legal system with a judiciary, courts, so on and so forth. And what we didn't realize is that, or what we weren't fully cognizant of as Americans, was that most Afghans had a long-standing preference for an informal dispute resolution system where tribal elders on the local level would resolve disputes in a very quick, efficient manner. So most Afghans didn't really buy into this new system that the U.S. was trying to support with hundreds of millions of dollars. And what that allowed was for the Taliban to come in and say, well, look, in a chaotic situation where there are competing warlords, you want to get things done, you want to resolve disputes, you want to avoid having a chaotic situation. The Taliban came in and said, we can get that done for you in a way that the central government isn't getting it done. And that provided a real opening for the Taliban to come in and say, hey, you might not agree with our extremist ideology, but what we can give you that the government can't give you is what I call in the piece rough and ready justice. This kind of brutal efficiency of dispute resolution, where you kind of knock heads together on a local level and you tell different tribal groups or factions to just resolve things very quickly instead of going through the bureaucratic red tape of the central government and of the US funded courts that a lot of Afghans didn't actually even trust.
So yeah, so let's expand on this a little bit. So you're right here that the Taliban is part of a society, or Afghanistan is by and large a society which is a tribal society. Let's say, I think around 40% are Pashtuns, and then Duranis are like 12%, and the Ghilzais are around 15% or something of that sort is the makeup of that society. And what I have understood is that there was a Durrani elite, and they had a kind of tussle between the Duranis and the Barakzai, and all these tribal conflicts are happening in a society. So now, how do we solve this conundrum, Shadi? Because in my eyes, this is a classic case of a post-industrial society imposing its methods on a pre-industrial society, and the tussle is actually anthropological, nothing else, to be very honest. It is a society which is anthropologically pre-industrial, and here you have a post-industrial culture coming there. Now, I don't even want to get into because I believe the post-industrial culture is objectively better than the pre-industrial one, but we are not into a popularity contest. We're not doing that, but we're trying to understand. But then, how does a mega power like America, with so many think tanks and so many intellectuals, so many area experts, where you have a person getting into an area, studying the literature, reading the language, understanding the language, spending time with the tribals, getting everything in order, and they can't get this basic reality that it's like giving everybody this technology, but they're not ready for it. So now, one side of the argument was they should have never gone in, but there are points that yes, maybe after 9/11 there was a case to go in, but then now there is a case that how do you go out? So how, first of all, how do you solve this pre-industrial, post-industrial conundrum then?
Yeah, so obviously it's quite challenging. I mean, one thing I'll say is, so I'm not a universalist insofar as it relates to liberalism. I don't believe that all cultures and peoples need to necessarily follow this liberal trajectory towards the end of history. That said, just because Afghanistan is more pre-industrial and is less developed, I don't think that means Afghans did not want or weren't ready for democracy. And when I say democracy here, I mean it in a more procedural, minimal sense. I'm not talking about the Western style American approach that has all of these other things. I think that it's a universal sentiment with all peoples and cultures and religions, is that individuals want a say in how they're governed. They want to feel like they have some agency in their own lives, and I think Afghans are no exception to that. So if I would prioritize, I would focus more on the procedural side in a kind of decentralized federal approach where you emphasize the local and you try to empower Afghans on the local level to have space to make their own decisions, even if that means that they would be more sympathetic to Sharia, not necessarily the Taliban's interpretation of Sharia, which I don't think is the majority approach among Afghans. But what we do know is that the vast majority of Afghans do want Sharia to play some role in public life. Now, what does that mean in practice? That's where there's a lot of variation. But the basic premise that the majority of Afghans don't necessarily want to have a secularized system, I think most people would agree on that. Now, the question is, why is it that the US and Americans post 9/11 didn't understand those basic things or weren't willing to fully take them into account? Well, I think there was a real tension with the Bush administration after 9/11, where Bush, as many listeners might recall, didn't actually want nation building. He was very skeptical of nation building. But at the same time, he had these ambitious ideas where he wanted Afghanistan to stop being a focal point for terrorism and to prevent Al-Qaeda and other jihadist groups from having a foothold. So the question is, so he was torn in these two different directions of wanting to make Afghanistan less hospitable to jihadism, but he also said that he was skeptical of nation building. So America, and this is the problem, I think, contrary to previous empires, if we want to use that term, we act in many ways like an imperial power, but we're not actually willing to fully embrace the implications of the imperial mindset. So we have one foot in and one foot out. So we want to do things on the cheap. And I think it made sense for the Bush administration to go along. So, for example, in the 2004 Bonn Agreement, which set the framework for the new Afghanistan in terms of its electoral and political system, it was easy for us to go along with Hamid Karzai and other people like him who wanted to have a strong presidency because they wanted to centralize power. Because we didn't want to get into nation building, we pretty much said, okay, that works for us. Hamid Karzai, he seems moderate. He seems like someone who gets us. He spent time in the West. So we'll kind of accept the idea that he will concentrate power in his own factions, in the people who are close to him, so on and so forth. And so in that sense, we were outsourcing the future of Afghanistan to these corrupt leaders who maybe were okay in some ways or better than the alternative, but they had their own interests in mind, which was primarily power and primarily getting their own way at the expense of having a more decentralized federal structure that would bring in a more pluralistic factions. So, that's how I would sort of, it's more complicated than that, but that I think is the short version of, we're in, but we're also out. And we weren't really sure as Americans of what we really wanted and how long we wanted to stay.
But this hasn't this been the kind of tone and tenor in American foreign policy when it comes to, I don't know, I always, in a very tongue-in-cheek way, say giving freedom and democracy to the rest of the world, which is what America keeps doing. They always keep going and giving freedom and democracy to the world. I find it very funny. But here's the thing. Now, let's say you just said it was an in and out approach. So wasn't there, if I'm not mistaken, a real school of thought that genuinely believed that if we want to get into Afghanistan, we have to stay there for like at least 50 to 60 years. It has to be for the long haul. We literally have to, go down to the bottommost barrel. But then you run into problems of the local kind in America, where maybe the local population in America might be like, why are we spending our taxpayer dollars on these things? So how does one balance this out? Like, what is the mood? Are there any surveys in America that gauge these kinds of things, and can those surveys be taken seriously?
Yeah, well, you did have, as you're saying, you did have this kind of what we might call a more neocon approach that said, hey, we have to be in there for 20, 30, 40 years, however long it takes. But the problem is, that might be plausible if you have one president who believes that. But when you have first Bush, then Obama, then Trump, then Biden, each of them are paying attention to domestic considerations in different ways. And they realize that over time, the American people don't really have the stomach. Like, it's hard to tell Americans, hey, we're going to be here for 40 years, however long it takes. You can say that, and maybe some Americans would be sympathetic and were sympathetic after 9/11, where there was broad support for a long-term presence in Afghanistan because people were thinking about 9/11 and they were afraid about future terrorist attacks. But after a certain period, people start to move on, and 9/11 doesn't play the same role in the American imagination as it once did. It becomes harder to make that case, especially when we're focusing more inward as a country. Internal divisions, especially in the Trump era, are becoming more paramount. Afghanistan disappeared from the public debate for several years, even when Trump last year was signing the deal with the Taliban. And this is an incredible, just try to imagine this for a second. Here are incredible images of senior US officials in Doha shaking hands and sitting down with Taliban leaders. You would have thought that Americans would find that odd and that would be a major public debate, but it didn't actually get much coverage. And, so even something like that, making common cause with the Taliban when we considered them our arch enemies in 2001 and 2002, and then 18 years later, Americans kind of shrugged their shoulders. Oh, we're making peace with the Taliban. Trump seems to be fine with them and he wants to bring them to Camp David, all of that stuff. So I think that the fact that Americans, don't have the long-term focus on these issues, and then our politicians and our policymakers are also they also have a short-term attention span. It makes it hard to do something that lasts 40 years, right? And quite frankly, I was someone who was generally supportive that we had to think about withdrawal at some point. I wouldn't do it the way that the Biden team did it, but I don't think it was plausible to say we're just going to stay there forever without having a clear plan of what we wanted to do. I think at some point you have to come to terms with the fact that this can't go on forever. So I think that this is where it really becomes challenging, that there's no great alternative. So you have someone like me who's criticizing Biden, and I was very critical of the way he did this. I think what we've seen is utter incompetence of a magnitude that I would have never dreamed about if you had talked to me a year ago. But at the same time, the supporters of the Biden team, they say, well, okay, fine. It wasn't done well. We could have anticipated some of the difficulties better, but what was the other alternative? There was no great option. So I think that when it comes to the American people and what they have a kind of tolerance for, I think there's also an awareness that, there isn't a great case to make, because no option was really ideal in any particular way. And the American people weren't paying attention for the last 3, 4, 5, 6 years. And all of a sudden now everyone is paying attention. And there's something, I think, I don't want to say disingenuous, but I think there's something odd about the fact that all of a sudden everyone is commenting, and even I'm paying more attention. I mean, I've written about this at different points, but to be fair, I wasn't paying as much attention to this last year either. So everyone now is just trying to understand what's going on for the first time, where it's a page one story. And that's what's hard to kind of deal with this, is that sometimes people are paying attention, but most of the time Americans don't care about Afghanistan and don't want to pay attention to what was going on the ground.
Yeah, but here's the interesting bit. Now let's talk about the way the Biden administration has handled this. Now I don't know where to start, to be very honest, from the timing, because from what I understand, if they would have done this in the winter, the Taliban would have been far less active, and the Taliban would not have maybe been in a position to take over as quickly as they could have, because of the weather conditions, maybe in Afghanistan and those kinds of things. That's point number one. Second, the way they have done things, the way they have carried out. I mean, look, all I can do is I can just look at the White House briefings, which are shown in the media in India, where the communication, even for a person who is just sitting here in India, and when I listen to them, and I just sit here wondering, is it these people are professional politicians and spokespersons of a major political outfit, and in the United States of America, which is the most powerful country in the world, and and they just sound like people who have no clue about what is happening. And then there's the statement about Americans are going to be in this position, then Americans who are staying there who want to leave, they can come, then this is happening, and then you have the unfortunate incident of the bomb blast where so many innocent Afghans and American troops have passed away, and the entire discourse. And then when I look at all this now, I don't know how the Trump administration would have handled it. I don't know, because hindsight is always 2020, right? You don't know how they would have handled it. But there was this whole narrative with the Biden administration where, oh, now the adults are in the room. The adults are going to take care of everything. And Sam Harris, I mean, it doesn't get more anti-Trump than Sam Harris. I mean, Sam has a pathogenic hatred for Trump at times. I mean, it just comes across as that. And even for a guy like Sam to go, I'm eating my words syllable by syllable.
Yeah, I saw that. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm just like, what the hell is going on? I mean, what is this administration trying to do? Look, like I said, I have no skin in the game. I could care less sitting here. But I just look at it and I just think, is there any way? Is there a defense for the Biden administration?
Yeah, so even if Trump had been just as bad, I think in many ways this is worse because our expectations are different. I mean, Kushal, as you alluded to right now, the whole point of Biden conceptually is that he would be competent, he would be responsible, he would get things done. And for a president who has been talking about competence and bringing in the adults in the room and these senior officials who are supposedly the best and the brightest, and some of them actually are. I mean, this is why we always have to put the best and the brightest in scare quotes, because yes, people can be brilliant. Yes, they can be smart, but that is not enough to have a good policy. And we're seeing this right now. And I've had conversations with them in the past. I don't know them super well, but like these are people that you respect, like Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, and Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor. And being in some of the same circles as them, you do develop a respect. These are smart guys, but you see them speaking to the public, and you wonder what is going on here. How can we explain this terrible messaging and the tone deafness of how they're talking to reporters about this? And I think that a lot of this, the buck stops with the president. And ultimately, Joe Biden is someone who is very stubborn. He's had a particular view about Afghanistan for a long time. It's clear that he wanted to just get out. And he didn't have patience to kind of postpone this until the winter or to have a different modified timeline. You could tell that he just wanted to be done with this so he could refocus on his priorities. And I think that when you see that coming from the president, it has an effect on the other senior staff. They take his cues. And so they saw that Biden wasn't really engaged on this. So they themselves weren't particularly engaged on this either. They didn't really make this a priority. They didn't care as much as they should have. And on Twitter after Biden gave his first big address after the Taliban takeover the other week, I was struck by just how callous Biden sounded when he was talking about Afghans. He was pretty much blaming it on them and not taking responsibility and saying, hey, look, we're not going to fight for them if they're not willing to fight for themselves, forgetting the fact that more than 60,000 Afghan security and military personnel were killed by the Taliban from 2001 onwards. We forget about that. Afghans have been willing to fight and die for the future of their country. But when they saw that the US was basically pulling the rug from under them, and where a lot of the Afghan army was dependent on US training, US spare parts and maintenance, on the more than 10,000 contractors who help them run their equipment, when all that is pulled in just a matter of a couple months, it's going to have a devastating effect on morale. So it's understandable when I look at Afghans. If I was an Afghan, I probably wouldn't want to fight for the government or for the Afghan army either, because I could see that the US was making it by pulling out this support. It was going to be very hard to actually run the equipment and advanced weaponry in a very basic level. So I think all of this to me suggests that there was a level of cruelty from the Biden administration and that's why the word betrayal is used. I don't want to overstate that, but yes, if you talk to many Afghans now, if you see what they're saying, it's understandable that they would feel betrayed, because there was a sense that Biden himself did not have much sympathy for their plight. It was all about America first. And that's why I think another way of looking at it is that Biden is not too dissimilar from Donald Trump. He talks in the same way about prioritizing national interests in this very narrow way, where it's we got to prioritize America's interest, American lives. And if that means some Afghans are going to be left to the fray, so be it. And that is similar to the kind of approach that Donald Trump had as well.
Yeah, it's a very weird sort of a conundrum. Like I clearly remember, certain statements. Like I think it was Blinken who had said that there, if and when they kind of leave, Afghanistan, that they would have an agreement with the Taliban, and that agreement is going to be conditions based. I clearly remember reading an article that the emphasis here is on conditions based. What the hell are those conditions? You're literally kind of packed into a airport. They've taken over whatever they want to take over. They have given you a deadline, which is 31st August, which is going to be over tomorrow. And after that, basically all bets are off. And now I want to connect this to the media coverage in America. Now, look, I will be the first one to say that, yes, Fox News is completely softballing things to Trump. I accept that. But there has always been this narrative inside America that, Fox News is pro-Trump, but all the other media outlets are very neutral. I mean, as a human being, I believe no human being is neutral. We can be indifferent to things. We're not neutral. Let's be very clear. Like, I'm very open. I'm biased. But I try to be objective as much as I can in my understanding. But then you add the media. I mean, I remember like Foreign Policy magazine saying, "Oh, it is a return to normalcy." Then you had the New York Times saying, "Oh, the end of the tumultuous years under Trump. Now Blinken has come back." But honestly, even now, it's not. The media is still throwing softball questions. Most of them, they're not really, as they say, going after the administration. I mean, you look at the questions thrown at Jen Psaki, and Jen Psaki, there are no curveballs, and she can just deflect and whatever she wants to do. So what does it say about the American media then? I mean, is it really American interest, or they're just partisans now, whether it's Fox News or whether it's CNN or everyone? I guess every side has a partisan media. The Republicans could do well with 2-3 more, but yeah, the Democrats have 2-3 now.
Yeah, well, so I would maybe just emphasize a little bit more how bad Trump was on this. I mean, and this is where I think there's a lot of hypocrisy, whether it's from Fox News or Republicans who are being very critical of Joe Biden now. I think we have to be, if we want to be fair, we got to acknowledge that Biden's hands weren't completely tied, but they were partly tied by Trump's deal with the Taliban last
Absolutely.
year, which I think if we look back at the text of that agreement, it's a disaster. It's just remarkable. I mean, for one, Trump cut a deal with the Taliban without the Afghan government being a party to it. They were cut out, and it's remarkable. We have a lot of leverage because the Taliban leaders were being killed by us by drone strikes for years. They wanted to stop that. So we had a lot of leverage to basically say, hey, if you want us to stop killing your leaders, then you have to do X, Y, and Z. But we didn't really ask a whole lot from them. And pretty much they just gave us assurances that they're not going to let Al-Qaeda or other terrorist groups operate from Afghan soil. Important, great. But that's not the only thing we should have been asking for. We should have said, we are not going to withdraw until there is a deal between the Taliban and the Afghan government and make that a priority. But instead, it's listed as item number 4 as, oh, the Taliban and the Afghan government, they will conduct talks in the future. So we were leaving it as an item to basically be postponed instead of really insisting on it. So naturally, and once you sign a deal, then you lose all your leverage because we can't go to the Taliban after we already sign a deal with them and say, well, actually, you know what, guys, we'd like to add some other things on the deal. They'll say, too late. We already had this conversation. So, it's an interesting, and, perhaps in history books and memoirs, we'll hear more about exactly why Trump was such a bad negotiator. And it's not Trump himself; it's his senior officials, Zalmay Khalilzad and others, who basically did, a very unequal deal with the Taliban. The Taliban got a lot more than we got out of it, right? So I think that's the first thing we have to say, and that's why when I see Republicans freaking out and talking about how Biden is humiliating the U.S. with this surrender. The surrender started last year with Trump because I think part of the reason is Trump wanted to show that he was a deal maker, that he was able to do something others hadn't done before. This would make him look good before the election. Also, the majority of Americans wanted us to get out, depending on what polls you looked at. Okay, so that's that. When it comes to how the partisan media is looking at Biden now, I haven't, I'll maybe defer more to you, Kushal, on this. Since I don't have a TV, I don't have like the fullest sense of how softball-y the questions are. From what I've seen, and what I do look at is the New York Times homepage pretty much every day. I have my critiques of the New York Times, but at least you'll know that you have reporters on foreign policy, not on all countries, but I think on Afghanistan. Generally, their coverage is pretty good. And I see that they are generally taking Biden to task. There's been a lot of critical coverage, New York Times, Washington Post, about the incompetence of the Biden administration. Maybe it could be even more critical, or maybe there could be more anger. But I'll just say, as being part of the establishment here in DC, being part of the so-called blob and think tanks and all of that, I'd say a lot of us have been extremely critical of the Biden team, even though I voted for Biden. I want, I'm a Democrat, even though I'm someone who's critical of the Democratic Party in a number of ways. So, I mean, I think that we are holding this administration to task. Could it be more? And I'm not sure about other, I haven't seen the TV outlets as much, but I think you're right that generally if Trump had done this, it's fair to expect that everyone would be even more critical than they currently are. Like whatever Trump does, the very fact that he's involved makes people more angry and they take it more personally and so on. And anyway, so that's my thought on that.
Yeah, because if you ask me honestly, and look, I'm not someone who's a Trump supporter. Like I'm a libertarian by nature. So if I was in America, Trump is not my guy. So I'm very clear. I just want to state that on the record here. I
Yeah.
find that guy to be absurd. Very entertaining, but very absurd. But here's my point. I'm sure if Trump would have done this, I would have seen rallies in America, in all major cities, again shouting and screaming, "Not my president," with placards holding uh, Muslim Lives Matter or something of that sort. I know this was going to happen. It is so predictable it's going to happen, because I just think when it comes to these sort of things, in general, the left has a more, as they say, a penchant for performative arts when it comes to activism. It's just the left wing worldview, and they always tend to be more performative in their activism. And whether it's their activism on social media or whether it's their activism on the ground,
Yeah.
that's just a very left wing trait. I think a conservative right wing trait has always been, leave me alone. I just want to kind of live my life, kind of a thing. I just think that's always been the way. Although there is this alt right in America that seems to be the exact copy of the performative left in terms of getting down on the ground and all the placards and stuff like that, which I find very interesting. But the classical conservative has always been, leave me alone. So I definitely feel, if you ask my opinion, I think if Trump would have done this, as they say, shit would have hit the roof. There would have been chaos. Everybody, oh, we're all gonna die. Where? Oh, no, 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 we're all gonna die in America. How? He's leaving Afghanistan. No, but we're gonna die in America. We don't have an answer for that, but we're gonna die for sure. So I do feel that would have happened, and which is why I find it absurd. Like, I find the whole claim that CNN claims neutrality absurd to the core. I'll be very honest here. I find it laughable as a human being and as a thinker that somebody can even use the word neutral for themselves, as if, I mean, how are you neutral? I don't know, but I've heard this word specifically used from CNN journalists sitting in India, watching on the news channel. And I always tell my family members, why do they keep calling themselves neutral? So I find this performative aspect in American media a lot. And I think this virus has gone into even late night comedy shows in America, where even I think they are part of this larger political narrative, as if they also have to toe the line. I don't know what they're going to do that Trump is gone. But now let's talk about this. Do you think there will be a political fallout of this, where, I don't know, I recently heard, I don't remember the polling numbers, but I think Biden's popularity numbers have fallen down post
Yeah.
this. It has affected. Obviously, look, I get it. Human memory is very short. Like, we're shouting about this right now, but then, I remember this analogy told to me by a veteran journalist. I'm not going to take the name here, but that journalist had explained this thing about media coverage across the world to me. And we have this weird phenomenon in India, right? We have a lot of stray dogs in India, and they're like, when the car passes by, the stray dog gets very agitated, because I guess because of the lights or something of that sort, and they run after the car and they bark, and then the car goes, and then another car comes, and the dog starts it again, and it's always the same. She's like, so the news items are like the cars that pass by, and the cars keep changing, like the news items keep changing, and we the people keep changing. So do you really think this is going to have any long-term impact on Joe Biden? I really don't see Joe Biden doing a second term, just from physical health parameters. But if he was to, I wish him the best of health and happiness in his life. But do you think this kind of a nightmarish scenario where, not only just Taliban lives, but American soldiers losing their lives? I think that right now the count is, I don't know, 12 or 13. I don't remember the exact count. Do you
Hmm.
think this is going to have any electoral impact in the long term?
Yeah, look, I think it definitely will, not because Americans care that much about Afghanistan or Afghans, but I think that one thing we can say about the American people is that we don't like to be losers. We don't like to be perceived as being humiliated on the world stage. So when we see these images, and I think we're also responsive to images, and we've already had a number of defining pictures and videos that I think are going to be hard to put out of our memory. I mean, the picture of people, trying to hang on for dear life as the American planes are trying to
Terrible.
leave the runway. I mean, I'm not going to forget that. So even if it's not totally fair to the Biden administration, people will still interpret things a certain way, and they're beginning, I think, they inevitably are going to associate Biden with maybe being a little bit weaker than they expected, that Biden isn't as competent as they thought he would be. So even if you're sympathetic to withdrawal, you still can't help but be affected by this, because especially, it undermines a core claim of the Biden administration, as I mentioned earlier. But also, I think, what was one of the main reasons Biden said we have to withdraw from Afghanistan? One of the main reasons is that we can't keep on putting our American service members in harm's way. But now, with 14 being killed, they have been put in harm's way, contrary to what Biden was promising. So Biden's policies, inadvertently and indirectly, have led to a situation where, once again, Americans are being killed in terrorist attacks thousands of miles away. So these are the core claims. These are the core reasons behind what he said, that we want to stop that from happening. He said that we're going to be competent. So I think that it's going to be hard to recover from that. And one major difference between Biden and Trump is that now that I'm hearing the case that you made, Kushal, I think you're actually right, that we can imagine there being protests and slogans and Muslim lives matter. Like, the resistance would find a way to make this about Trump and to kind of to magnify it and amplify it. But at the same time, Trump would have had an advantage, because he would have found other ways to piss people off and other controversies. With Trump, it's hard to focus on one thing. So Trump probably would have done something else a week or two after, and people would have had to kind of focus on whatever the new controversy was. The problem with Biden, he's not like that. He doesn't come up with new controversies. So it's been 2 or 3 weeks where this has been the number one issue. It's been on the front page of the New York Times every single day. It's because he doesn't really have a lot of other things to distract us from the Afghanistan debacle. So it seems like we're going to keep on focusing on this, at least for a few more days, maybe longer. We'll see. But that's a problem that Biden has, is that he doesn't have the same political skills, if you want to call it that, to distract people from his incompetence. Trump was always able to find new distractions.
Yeah, I guess in the case of Trump, his weakness was his strength, that he had a dedicated group of haters. I think, which is incomparable to Biden. I don't think so. Biden has that kind of people who hate him, that kind of pathological hatred, that, like, I call it the Sam Harris hatred standard. Like, Sam's hatred for Trump is hilarious. For a person who is so rational, when I listen to Sam on Trump, I start cracking up every time I listen to him. I don't know. I find it so funny that I can't control myself, because I'm a subscriber of his podcast. I listen to every podcast. I love listening to him. And he's such a bright guy, and I just find it funny, and I keep laughing. And I can just imagine, Trump, all it would have taken Trump was he would have tweeted something about some obscure issue in America, and everybody would have run, because look, Trump was the best business offer for media. Like, media, you know the numbers better than I do in America. I mean, with Trump, all the media houses were just going up and up and up, and they were like, oh, he is the second coming. I don't know, as far as they are concerned, as far as their big business prospects are concerned. So in that sense, but with Biden, I think the only saving grace, again, this is my analysis sitting in India, I think the only thing that he's going to be saved with is the vice president, because they're going to be like, if we get rid of him, she comes. Okay, let's stick to Biden. At least there's something over there. I'm just being very honest. Sitting in India, that's the impression we get. Now, I could be wrong, and if the viewer sitting in America, because I do have a significant American viewership too, if they see, Kushal, what the hell are you talking about? Look, I'm just sitting here and making a comment that the vice president is seen to be even more incompetent, even with a functioning Biden before the Afghanistan fiasco. So I guess maybe, I don't know, maybe that's the saving grace for Biden in the long run.
But I think also, like, it's interesting that you mentioned the vice president because I kind of forgot about her. And it's remarkable how little she figures into the conversation. In some ways, she's become a non-entity. Like, people have, I think, she wasn't hugely popular at the beginning, but I think there's been a major people have just kind of lost faith in her. And I think there's not a whole lot of optimism that she would be a strong candidate in 2024. So I think you bring up a good point, is that, if we're talking about people have issues with Biden, and Biden isn't great on foreign policy, and he looks like he's more incompetent than he seemed before, but the alternative isn't great. I mean, Kamala, she just hasn't really been. Maybe on domestic policy, people have more respect for her because that's where her strengths lie. But on foreign policy, forget about it. And it's just interesting that I'm not even sure she said much about Afghanistan, or, usually you look to the vice president to kind of be part of the conversation. In this case, she's certainly not present in that way. Yeah, I mean, look, I was just reading this there's a New York Times piece yesterday about how internally Democrats are becoming increasingly concerned that the House might flip to the Republicans. And it's not just about Afghanistan. I think it's a general sense that in August has been a pretty bad month for Biden. The Delta variant has gotten worse. The vaccine policy isn't going well. It's just like a lot of the things that we thought Biden would be good on, his core strengths, the two major issues in American politics today, at least today, it might change next week, are the virus and Afghanistan. On those two things, Biden just doesn't seem like he's up to the task. There's a sort of sense of exhaustion, that he's tired. He's not really there. And I don't mean to make a comment about his cognitive abilities. I'm not a fan of that whole discourse, but there's a sense that he's just not up to the task in a more general sense, that he's just not a great president. He's not a strong president, even if he's a better president than Donald Trump. I mean, the bar is low. I think for those of us who are anti-Trump, I mean, it's not hard to clear that very basic bar, but we also want our Democratic presidents to just be competent. We want to feel confident that they know what they're doing. And I think we can't really say that with any level of assuredness, that we think that this man, Biden, can really get things done. And that's where it's a kind of intangible thing. It's not about numbers. It's not about poll numbers necessarily. It's about, do we feel good about this guy? And I think a lot of us are starting to feel like, oh, he had a good first 6 months, but he just doesn't seem up to it these days. And at least recently, we'll see if he can recover. But for now, that's, I think, the sentiment.
Yeah. So one last question, Shadi. So I think this is more like a macro narrative question. So I'll lay out what I feel. Now, a lot of people don't like to admit this, but a globalized world will never be in a kind of scenario which a lot of people think that, yes, there will be democracies, independent countries, but to say that the world is not going to have some sort of order where somebody acts like I don't know, to use this word in the most responsible way possible, policeman. I know people don't like to admit to this, but yeah, the world is always going to be having a policeman. Now, I'll be very open. I don't think India is going to be that policeman ever. Well, we are a country with an average income of $2,300 to $2,500. I think we should, fix our economy first, grow first, and then maybe, think outside those things. So in the current scenario, let's be as honest as possible. There are three players in the world, podium as such. On one side, you have America and its allies, whatever they are now. We don't even know who is America as an ally anymore. And there is China and maybe Russia. These are three ideologies and ideas that are, trying to be a world policeman in a different kind of way. The way America has behaved in Afghanistan. Now, I can tell you in India, the response has been very, 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 mixed. Like, people have Indians, a lot of Indians are disappointed with what America has done, especially in the case of Afghanistan, because India and Afghanistan have actually got very good relations. Also, the last time shit hit the roof in Afghanistan, things started happening in Kashmir. So we have not forgotten that. So whatever happens in Afghanistan tends to have a very direct consequence on India, obviously because of Pakistan and the whole ISI involvement with Taliban and various other issues. But the point is, the world was always going to have a policeman. And then recently we had, I think it was the Global Times of China saying, oh, now that the Americans have behaved like this in Afghanistan, how can Taiwan ever rely on America? And these kinds of feelers have already started to be given. What does this do? So, this will be my last question. What does this do to the overall American image as the world policeman?
Yeah, well, I think that what folks on the left don't always realize, or they're not willing to acknowledge it, is that there is going to be a hegemonic power. My view is that for all of its faults, and I'm very critical of the U.S. record when it comes to the Middle East, supporting authoritarian regimes, Israel, Palestine, as we talked about last time I was on. But if I had to choose between the U.S. being the hegemonic power or China or Russia increasingly filling that vacuum, it's no contest.
Yeah.
So that's why I think this is all very frightening, this sense that the U.S. just isn't up to the task anymore, whether it was Obama with the Syria red line, whether it was Trump's general, the sense that Trump was incompetent or didn't know what he was doing, whatever it might be. And now we have Biden making these mistakes in Afghanistan. If this keeps on happening time and time again with different presidents who are quite different from each other, it does start to, I think, have a profound effect on how people view us, whether or not they want to make common cause with us. And we've seen the coverage in various news reports that European officials, both publicly but also behind closed doors, what they're saying, we would have never expected this from the Biden team. You get a real sense that even they may not have had the highest expectations, but they're shocked. They're honestly shocked, and it makes them. Well, what is credibility? Credibility is a function of how people perceive you. It's not about facts. It's not about IR theory, international relations theories, where you're saying, well, here's what the academic literature says on credibility. No, I mean, credibility in the moment is about what people perceive. Whether their perceptions are accurate or not is a different issue. They might be wrong, but fine. Okay. So the Biden folks might say, well, European officials shouldn't be thinking this about us. Well, they are thinking that about us. And whatever their perceptions are at a given moment will shape European policy going forward, where they start to reassess certain things a little bit more. Or you have someone like Emmanuel Macron in France who says, this shows us more and more that we need to emphasize strategic autonomy. We need to start fending for ourselves more. There are European officials who see things more in that light. So I think that, that we're going to see more of that. Certainly if you're an Afghan, if you're someone in the Afghan army now, obviously you're going to think to yourself, you know what? Whatever the U.S. promises us in the future, we're done. This is bullshit. At some level, there's a limit to the number of betrayals that you can sort of take on. And if it keeps on happening, you might say, well, in previous administrations, there were other betrayals, but people still had no other choice but the U.S. Fine. That'll probably still continue. The U.S. is still the superpower. The U.S. still provides things that China and Russia can't provide. But we can't rest on our laurels. At some point, this starts to have an effect. And these things are hard to measure, especially in the moment. And we'll have to kind of look 10 or 20 years down the road and try to track when things really started to change, or when certain groups started to lose even more faith in American commitments. But we shouldn't want to test that. So when people say, well, Shadi, don't worry too much about this. People always complain about the U.S., but they keep on coming back to us. Maybe. But do we really want to test that proposition? How much do we want to push that assumption? And that's what I worry about.
Yeah, I hear you. I think there's a lot of chatter even inside Indian circles. I think India has had this discussion too, and India is a serious player in the world stage too. No matter what people want to say, India is a
Yeah.
very big player in the world stage. And if there are talks like that happening in India too, as in what the hell did the Americans just do? Especially when it comes to Afghanistan, India and Afghanistan and that entire area is of a humongous strategic interest to India from India's foreign policy perspective. So yeah, I hear you, and I hope America self corrects, because let me be very clear, and I don't care. Sometimes, the kind of audiences I have, they're like, oh, why do you have to say that? Look, the world needs America. Because I always tell people, because if America fails, in a way, democracy fails. You want
Yep.
democracy to fail? You want communism to succeed? I don't. I for sure don't want communism to succeed, because, again, like I always said, moral objectivist here. Some systems are better than others. Democracy is objectively better than communist dictatorship. So I would never. I wish the greatest of happiness and wealth to an average Chinese person. I wish nothing but happiness to them. But their system sucks. In my eyes, it sucks.
Yes.
Their government sucks. I'm sorry, and I'm not going to apologize for that. Uh, is China richer than India? Absolutely. But do I think India has a better system than China in political governance? Hell yeah. I love my country's system. I don't want to. And when I see people literally praying for America's failure, and then even Americans in a weird way kind of praying for the failure because of political tribalism, I don't know. I just sit here and I wonder. I mean, have I don't know. Maybe people have lost it. I don't know. I'm wrong, but oh well. What do we do? So I guess we'll end the talk over here, Shadi. Once again, pleasure talking to you, and I'm really happy that at least when I reach out to you, you come and chat, because nowadays, with the kind of polarization we have thanks to social media, it's impossible to convince people to come and chat across platforms. Otherwise, we live in silos, and I'm actually glad that
Yeah.
you do come out and always, agree to talk to me whenever I've reached out to you. So thank you very
Yeah,
much.
and it's Kushal, great to be with you. It's good to be on a second time, and hopefully to be continued. Always enjoy talking.
All right, guys. So we'll end today's discussion. I'll leave all the links to Shadi's work, whether it's his work in the Atlantic or Wisdom of the Crowds or his book. That will be there in the description of the podcast. So please go and buy his book and read his book. It's an excellent book. I think everybody should read. If you want to support the podcast, please subscribe to the channel, like the video. You know the